Guys, David Vose again. Beautiful day out here in the paradise of Red Mesa, New Mexico. Blue skies, but it's windy, and we had some snow flurries. So, might be a little bit of snow in the morning when I wake up. But I do think I may have figured out why. I just found out that a volcano has been waiting to erupt. I think it was on the 4th of this month that a volcano has erupted in Guatemala. It's called Santiaguito or something. And as I've told you guys before, I remember distinctly back in 1980 when Mount St. Helens went off. And that year we didn't get any snow in Idaho. And it has decreased the amount of snow and changed the weather ever since. And I confirm that my thoughts that I noticed and I watched since 1980, and I was always telling everybody that that was the reason, because of Mount St. Helens. And I know we've had other volcanoes go off and stuff like this, but it's pretty odd that the weather has been so odd. And it was just leading up to this volcano going off. And there may have been some other ones that's been going off that I haven't paid attention to. But I suspect we're going to have some violent volcanic activity here coming up. The Bible says that the earth will be having these volcanic eruptions as we go into the Great Tribulation. But anyway, here is a clip, a real brief little picture of that volcano going off. So anyway, I don't know, but that's interesting. And today we're just having some crazy weather. Now we're getting winter again. It's almost like as if the cork blew off and now it's kind of, getting colder again here for a minute. Things are starting to equalize, and I just know it has something to do with that volcano. But guys, I got some other information for you. We've been going along talking about, well, all these buildings across America that they burned down in, just before 1914, around that time, 1890s, were burning down all these buildings. And we've been talking about Mary Magdalene, the Knights of St. John, and American history, and the French that were over here before the British. We're going to talk a lot about that today, because we've never been told our history. And I'm going to show you that the history hasn't been hidden from us. It's just been overlooked. We actually have pretty much all the history we need, but it's the way people present it. People that write books and just ignore the whole French equation. And it isn't just a matter of knowing that the French were here. Remember, we've also been talking a lot about Peter Waldo. Otherwise, that word Waldo in different languages, it's Valois or Val, but it means valley. And the descendants of the valley, or Peter Waldo, were known as they go down, they had descendants. And one of the ways that they ended up spelling it is Valois. And we're gonna catch up with them here, because we've talked a lot about these Inquisitions, and the world knows about several of them. We call it the Waldensian Albigensian Inquisition. Then we've had the Spanish Inquisition, which was like 1492, somewhere in there. And this was part of why Columbus took his boat and came to America. They were expelling the Judeans and the Christians there. They were considered kind of Judean, Sephardic Judeans in Spain. They were almost kind of half between Islamic, Christian. They were also by blood Judean from Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And they ended up in Spain, were driven out of France. But when you drive people out, you drive out some of the elite, but you don't necessarily drive out everybody. They couldn't just exterminate all of France. So it continued on down through the years. until we come to another Inquisition that very few people even ever hear about or talk about, which is much more recent, which is the Huguenots. And the Huguenots were from France, and they were remnants. Now, they are not called Cathars. They probably had traditions that go back to Mary as well, but the world doesn't write books about them in this way to explain to us what's going on here. But these are the final remnants. There was wars going on. This is about the time that the Templars were infiltrated by the Catholics, and the Jesuits were building the Temple Church. The Templars building the temple in London, which is now running the whole world with the law, bar association, and the banking and all of the things that these Rothschilds and individuals did. But they were still trying to root out a stubborn belief, still being held by French people who hadn't yet left. So they were continuing to persecute them. The Huguenots were viciously persecuted. And we're going to find out what that has to do with the little babies that were being orphaned in America in a little place called Louisiana. Now, why do you suppose it's called Louisiana? Why do we have a city called St. Louis or Louisville or all these kinds of things in that area? Because it was all named after King Louis. I don't know whether you pronounce it Louis or Louis. I suppose you could pronounce it both ways. Here in America, I think a lot of us say Louis, but it's Louis. And King Louis XIV was King of France. And he was very much a part of the whole Louisiana area. And he was very much a part of this whole conspiracy that we're going to present to you today. How the French Huguenots were persecuted, fleeing persecution, came to the New York area, were enslaved and murdered there, and continued to be persecuted and kept down until they ended up dying, and all of their children were left. And the Catholic Church, now this is interesting, the French that were in America after around 1800 were all Catholic. But before that, they were Protestant. And the ones that were already here had already been forced to become Catholic. All of them. Roman Catholic. But the ones that were coming over from France, the Huguenots, were still Protestants. With this Cathar Waldensian early Mary Magdalene traditions. So they hated him. So they fled persecution, came to New York, but now the Catholics were running a show there, even with the other French. It was quite a conundrum, or whatever you would like to call it. It was crazy. It was a mind squeeze on these people because they were Protestants, but a lot of the French that were already here, up in Quebec and stuff, were now Roman Catholic because of this mind game that they were playing with them. So they made them very poor on purpose and brought them into the factories and made them slaves. If you don't believe that this goes on, take a little look at the slums in all the big cities and notice that for years, and probably still today, the inner slums of the city is peopled by certain minorities. Even Judeans back in the day when they were in a country where they weren't liked or welcome, they would put them in the ghetto, and they were repressed. Well, these individuals coming over they didn't want to just massacre them. They never did that, except for on occasions where they had an excuse, right? The Catholic Church had Inquisition, but time went down, and in the 1800s, it was like, oh, you can't just murder people. So they repressed them, and they persecuted them, and they made them slaves without letting them know they were slaves. Said, hey, we'll give you good money. They were dying. They didn't have any food. They were being persecuted, so they took jobs that were slave jobs. And they died with terrible... the children were working. They had child labor. It was the most evil situation, and it was all run by these Catholics. And these Masons of this York order that were bringing them over as slaves to work in their factories and murdering and killing them. There was no OSHA. It was not safe. It was very dangerous. They were all dying, and they took their children. And the Catholic Church literally made this big hospital, sanitarium, whatever, for the children. You saw pictures of that yesterday. And they got so many of these babies that they started sending them to Louisiana, over to New Orleans, and that's where they started the orphanage train. And they took these little orphans, abused and raped and pillaged them, and they purchased them. They were sold as slaves. The little children were sold as slaves, all from the Huguenots, all from the Cathars, same people that had been persecuted for years. And they re-educated them into the Catholic faith, or whatever faith they wanted to, whatever it was that they were doing. But they no longer had their parents to teach them about their Huguenot ways. This was a purposeful plot, a great conspiracy against the real truth of what Christianity really was, who Jesus really was and his wife Mary, the true faith, and those who would understand the truth would be free people. They didn't want free people, they wanted slaves. So they had to do this. Now let me read you just a little of this, and then we'll show you some other information. Right here it says the Huguenot history. The Huguenots were French Protestants. The tide of the Reformation reached France early in the 16th century and was part of the religious and political fomentation of the times. The Huguenots in France. You see that picture right there? It's very symbolic. There's a lot of symbology there. The Anglomi, you've heard of this in Dan Brown, this Golomi. This is a particular name that was right about the time when the Holy Roman Empire was infiltrating the Languedoc, called it Septimania. They ended up fleeing, and we've seen all the maps, the Mercator maps and the Peri-Resi maps, and all of them. It seems like all these maps were made by individuals who were fleeing persecution, coming to America, and every one of these maps are basically a map of how to get to the 7 cities of gold right here where I live in New Mexico. And we've talked about that, so we won't get into that today, but the thread that runs through history that explains what's been going on and all the persecution is going to be explained today here in a way that you might not have ever expected it, and I didn't either. But this kind of ties things together that we've been talking about. So it's all about getting rid of Jesus Christ and the truth and the knowledge of Jesus and who we are. So it says, Protestantism was quickly embraced by members of the nobility, by the intellectual elite, and by professionals in trades, medicine, and crafts. It was a respectable movement involving the most responsible and accomplished peoples of France. It signified their desire for greater freedom, religious and politically. The names of the Huguenot leaders at that time included the royal house of Navarre, Valois, and Condé, Admiral Coligny. Now there's that Valois, because the royal blood from Peter Waldo, now being written Valois, or the Valley people, is definitely something they were still trying to root out and wipe out. These people just kept having babies and they couldn't kill them all, and they were hiding from them. So it says hundreds of other officers in the military. Marguerite d'Angoulême, whom scholars have called the first modern woman, was an early supporter of the reform in the Catholic Church. Well, of course she was, because she was already now partly of the line of Jesus and of the Holy Roman Empire from some Judeans that he brought from Baghdad, of the line of Jeconiah, that was there because they hated Christ, and they were infiltrating the Templars and the Knights of St. John, and they were trying to force everyone to become Catholics. And so this modern woman, Marguerite of the Angoulême, was one of the ways that they were trying to make it popular to become a Catholic and, trying to ask them nicely, please become Catholic and renounce your Cathar beliefs. So it's Marguerite influenced her brother Francis I to be lenient with the Huguenots. To be lenient. Well, she had some Huguenot blood. The Huguenot church grew rapidly. Well, it was just the same people, the Cathars, and their beliefs that they had and their traditions for, the last 1,000 years, but they weren't allowed to follow their beliefs. And then this movement came along, and Anglomay lady, and it kind of became okay to become a Protestant. But they didn't realize that they were still holding on to these traditions, and so the Catholic Church really wasn't happy about it. So they tried to exterminate them, but they couldn't. Like at the time, it wasn't acceptable to just murder them all again. They'd have to wait and bide their time. They figured a way to persecute them and force them to literally leave, and many of them came to America. So this is going on in like 1560s and stuff like this. In the beginning, the Huguenots were greatly favored by Francis I because of their stature and their abilities, as well as their economic contribution to the country's finances. However, 90% of France was Roman Catholic at this point because, they had been forcing them to become Catholic and to renounce their faith all this time. And most of the population of France had already left in various places. And the Catholic Church was determined to remain the controlling power, to remain. They took it by force. The Huguenots alternated between high favor and outrageous persecution. Inevitably, there were clashes between Roman Catholics and Huguenots, many erupting into the shedding of blood. During the 1560s, the clashes worsened. Finally, the Catherine de Medici, this is probably where we get the royal family that produced the medicines that we have today, widow of Henry II, son of France I, and the Guise factions, together representing the crown and the church, organized a deadly act. Thousands of Huguenots were in Paris celebrating the marriage of Henry Navarre to Marguerite de Valois. So Margaret was wanting her husband, to be lenient on the Huguenots because she was of the lineage of the Valois, or Peter Waldo. On St. Bartholomew's Day, August 24th, 1572, on that day, soldiers and organized mobs fell upon the Huguenots, and thousands of them were slaughtered. So this was another Inquisition, but without so much the inquiry, just going in and murdering them. Gaspard de Coligny was among the first to fall at the hands of the servant of the Duke of Guise and was chopped to pieces. Pope Gregory XIII had a medal struck off in honor of the event and sent to Catherine and all Catholic prelates. Persecution and exile. Civil wars followed. On March 4th, 1590. Prince Henry of Navarre led Huguenot forces against the Catholic League at the Battle of Ivry in Normandy, resulting in a decisive victory. Then on April 13th, 1598, at the newly crowned Henry IV, he issued the Edict of Nantes, which granted the Huguenots toleration and liberty to worship in their own way. For a time, at least, there was more freedom for the Huguenots. However, about 100 years later, on October the 18th, 1685, Louis XIV, the one who they named Louisiana in America, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. Oh, so Louisiana, it was supposed to be a place for French people, was really being ruled over by a German Viking who lived in France, called himself Louis or whatever, and was forcing all of his French people out. And then when they got over here, he made a big state commandeering the original French people. And so they like, oh, he's French, And so they made Louisiana. But it wasn't really French. It was Louis XIV, who was in France, king of France, but was some bloodline from the Normandies or up in the 10 Germanic tribes. So they had infiltrated France. They'd done the Inquisitions. They'd done everything they could. They murdered them, massacred them. They, anathematized them. They did everything they could. And nothing completely worked. So they literally had to set up a kingdom that hated their own people and began to massacre them. Now, they probably couldn't do that with the Waldensian Inquisition was going on. The Holy Roman Empire would be just against France, right? And murdering French people. But by this time, it wasn't against France, because France was already mostly Roman Catholic. But there were still 10% of these Huguenots, and they were the ones that were still loved and liberty, and they were winning politically and culturally. And it made them furious. So they had to exterminate them, and that's when they ran them out. And then later on, they purchased Louisiana because the Huguenots wouldn't have sold their country, but Louis XIV sold the country because it was a tricky trick. He wasn't French. He was of Visigoth or Norman or something blood. So that was what they did. It was a grand trick played by the devil. Because that's what he does. He's the trickster. But as you can easily see then, it really wasn't in order just to help the Huguenots. That's for sure. Practice of the heretical religion was forbidden. Huguenots were ordered to renounce their faith and join the Catholic Church. They were denied exit from France under pain of death, and Louis XIV hired 300,000 troops to hunt the heretics down and confiscate their property. This revocation caused France to lose 500,000 of its best citizens. It was not until November the 28th, 1787, after the United States of America had gained its independence from England, that Marquis de Lafayette, who was impressed by the fact that so many of the American leaders were of the Huguenot descent, persuaded Louis XIV and the French Council to adopt the Edict of Toleration, guaranteeing religious freedom to all in France. Well, now they've got freedom, right? They're not going to be persecuted. Wait till they get to New York as immigrants and they become slaves. And they take their children and they die. Oh, we didn't mean for them to die. They're just working in an evil snake pit where there's venomous snakes and machinery that can cut off their head at any second. And we just take their children and re-indoctrinate them. So during the entire period between the early part of the 16th century to 1787, thousands of Huguenots left their homes in France for other countries because of reoccurring waves of persecution. As Esther Forbes wrote in Paul Revere and the World He Lived In, France had opened her own veins and split her best blood when she drained herself of her Huguenots, and everywhere in every country that would receive them, this amazing strain acted as a yeast. The Huguenots in America. Huguenot settlers immigrated to the American colonies directly from France and indirectly from the Protestant countries of Europe, including the Netherlands, England, Germany, and Switzerland. Although the Huguenots settled among almost the entire eastern coast of North America, they showed a preference for what are now the states of Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and South Carolina. Just as France suffered a notable loss through the immigration of these intelligent, capable people, so the American colonies gained. The colonists became farmers, laborers, ministers, soldiers, sailors, and people who engaged in government. Remember, this is back in 1718, early 1800. The Huguenots supplied the colonies with excellent physicians, expert artisans, and craftsmen. Wait till you find out. George Washington was a Huguenot. So this is why Jefferson and Madison, all these guys, were so in love with Monticello and Montpellier and the French and the Statue of Liberty, because the Huguenots came over in waves, and they were amazing Protestants. That's why we're a Protestant nation. They were Cathars. And they founded the country of justice and liberty for all. George Washington and these guys. So, for example, Irene DuPont brought this expertise for making gunpowder, learned from the eminent Lavoisier, and Apollo Revere, a goldsmith, was the father of Paul Revere. So Paul Revere was a Huguenot, master silversmith and renowned patriot. George Washington himself was the grandson of a Huguenot on his mother's side. The Huguenots adapted themselves readily to the New World. Their descendants increased rapidly and spread quickly. Today, people of the Huguenot origin are found all over the country. Wow. So what happened to him? Well, the Catholics couldn't just exterminate them, but you don't think they stopped trying, do you? So what they did was they tried to make them slaves. They worked in very difficult factories. They made their children slaves. They made life so hard that most of them just died. And all the children were then sent on these orphan trains to New Orleans, and then from there everywhere around the world to be placed with Catholic families to reintroduce them to the very people that murdered their own parents. And that's the truth. And so, I don't think you've ever heard this. I don't think anybody's ever told this story. We're telling it today. So, Colonial St. Louis. Discover the indigenous and Creole culture of St. Louis before the Louisiana Purchase. French merchant Pierre Laclede and Auguste Chateau selected an ideal site to build a commercial village, which they named St. Louis, near the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi. St. Louis became a hub for trade with regional American Indian tribes. They were working with the tribes. The 7-Year War, or the French and Indian War, Americans think, oh, that must have been the French fighting the Indians. No, that was the British fighting the Indians and the French, who were together fighting together. The French were cordial and even mixed with the Indians. They had relations. They fought together. They bled together. They traded with each other. French officials, Spanish administrators, and entrepreneurial citizens arrived and built the village into a significant trading post and the political capital of the region. St. Louis quickly became an affluent and cultured place due to its natural advantages and the people who came here to make their fortunes. See, I think a lot of people don't realize that. I never did. I always thought of the United States as, okay, you got the East Coast, and that's where you can have trade because there's a big ocean. And you got the West Coast, and that later on became where you could have cities and trade. But the middle of the country, you know, why is there even any cities there? Right? There's no trading going on there. Up the Mississippi and the Ohio, there was more trade there than there was on the East Coast. And the French almost won the war. But fate had a different plan. I think the French were not so interested in fighting a war unto the bloody death as much as the British. And guys, this is my opinion after much research and prayerful consideration. I'm convinced, completely convinced, that this whole thing was a conspiracy. From the days that Adam walked out of the garden, they were trying to kill the good people. The bad people were trying to kill the good people. And then when Christ came, they were trying to get rid of Christ. And then they killed Christ and all his disciples. And they were trying now to get rid of the truth and the freedom of man. Satan still wanted to put you under the law, right? The deity of vengeance. And so the conspiracy was that when they were running them out of France, we've gone through all the Waldensian, Albigensian Inquisitions, the Spanish Inquisition, and because they moved them to Spain and then they made Inquisition there. But now we're talking about the Huguenot, which was the 10% of France that were still Cathars, but weren't allowed to be. And they were persecuted and run out. Well, the ones that came over to America made New Francia. Not Louisiana, but New Francia. And they were true Cathars originally. And they fought bloody wars with the British. And they were stronger. And they were winning. But the British and the Normandies and the Holy Roman Empire, which is run by the Germanic tribes up there that conquered Rome and made the Holy Roman Empire, and were fighting and doing all the inquisitions and running them out. They got down to, we come to America, they drove us out and they went to America, and they're like, wait a minute, they're over there in America and they're building this huge Chilago and they got this great civilization, and what? You know, we got to go over there now and kill them over there. So they came over here and made the British 13 colonies, made New York, the New York Rite of the Masons, which is a 33 degrees to make everybody under some curse or some law. They were already in England doing the Templar, you know, the Bar Association, the lawyers and the banking and all this. And here's these agricultural, beautiful people believing in the New Jerusalem here in America. And they were trying to defend themselves. So we're going to show you some clips of how they fought in the war, and they were winning. But at some point, they began to lose. Now, what happened what happened that they started losing? Well, the French and the British were fighting over there in Europe. And all of the Holy Roman Empire and the 10 Germanic tribes in Britain and all of this that they had taken. They had power over Normandy and, you know, and areas further north, Viking peoples. They started persecuting them, got down to the Huguenots, they persecuted them, but then times began to be more liberal and you couldn't just kill people, and so they sprouted up again with some Protestants and they didn't like it. So all of these Germanic tribes that already conquered Rome and everything else, and already drove out the Waldensians and the Albigensians and the Spanish and so forth, and the Moors, and conquered everything, and set up their association bar and everything. They now defeated France and were pretty much gaining political clout in France, even though there were some, you know, remains of the Cathar spirit of liberty, with the liberty cap, the Tartarian liberty and the grace of the Lord Jesus, and not having to be a Catholic, and, you know, the anathemas and all the paper bulls and all the inquisitions. They were trying to find freedom. That's why they finally went to America and said freedom and justice and liberty for all. But even before that, when the Huguenots came over to America, they declared victory and said they had freedom. That's when George Washington, a Huguenot, and his brethren made the Constitution. So what were the 10 Germanic tribes that were trying to conquer the people of the Lord? What were they going to do? Well, they took over France and installed King Louis XIV. And then he came over and just, voila, I'm French. Come on over. You know, hey, I'm a good guy. We'll make Louisiana for you French people. Oui, oui, you Creoles and Cajuns and Canadians. But he was tricking them, because then he just said, oh, okay, we can't win the war with these British people. We'll infiltrate their French leader, their king, and he'll just declare Louisiana his, and then he'll sell it to us. And we purchased Louisiana in the Louisiana Purchase. So there was no more war. They just purchased them. That's what they did. They purchased them. It was a big trick. So, you see, the British were being urged and beckoned and pushed by Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and all of these people who were now making a pact with Satan, John Dee and Edward Kelly, bringing Satan up out of the bottomless pit, and had this world-conquering plan to colonize and beat down the West into submission, to bring in a new system. I don't think they necessarily wanted to murder all the people. I think they wanted a little of the seed left. They wanted to be the landowner and the husbandman, and they wanted to tell these people to breed with these people and breed a master race, you might say. And they wanted to keep these individuals, they want to get rid of their culture. They wanted it to be godless. They murdered all the buffalo. And then they had to murder the French and the Indians. And today we still have French people, and we still have American Indian people. They didn't murder them all, but they eradicated their concept or connection to the land. We don't even know that St. Louis is a huge trading mega metropolis economy going up the Mississippi, up Ohio, the Great Lakes, and all the great cities that were there. And so today when you read this stuff, you hear about the 17th century, but even they do not understand, because it's been wiped out in the wars, that the French were actually here, and some others even before the 17th century, even before the 15th century.
Well, I think there are two very, very important things that we have to keep in mind whenever we're dealing with French people on this continent, be they Quebecers, be they French Ontarians, be they French Manitobans, be they New England French or North Country, New York French, or Cajuns in Louisiana, or even Midwest French along the rivers in Missouri. And that is that there are two time periods, really, in which we discuss the French presence here. One of them is, of course, the very early period when this part of New York State, as well as the area around Canton and Helena, was actually part of New France. It was part of France's enormous North American empire. We have then to understand that this was the original reason for the French fact in North America. The French settled this area before English people did. And when their right to a heritage, their right to a language on this continent is put into question, it shouldn't be. In many cases, my friends, they were here first. They have a right to their language heritage. They have a right to their cultural heritage. And so I think we must understand that the French presence here is not something added on. It's not something that came in with an immigrant sort of flow. It is something that dates back to the very earliest period of this part of our state. And if anyone ever questions the French fact, they should understand that they were here first. The second important fact, I think, to remember whenever you're discussing French North Americans is that for almost all of these people, with the exception of the small and actually ephemeral colony in the Cape Vincent area in New York, and perhaps some of the Creole culture in Louisiana, there is one single lifestyle which is behind almost all of French North American culture. One single lifestyle. And it is what I call the habitant lifestyle. Habitant, or habitant as it's known in English, terrible pronunciation, refers to a particular style of life in which people were agriculturally based, had rudimentary, if any, education, were extremely devoted to the family, and were very, very committed to preserving the French language.
Why? This is something I'd always wondered about. Whenever they look at who was in the United States when we got here, they always give you the impression there were just a bunch of natives running around, hoota, 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 around the fire with a little feather in their hat. Or, well, they didn't even have a hat, a feather in their hair. And maybe they were some kind of demonistic tribes worshiping Satan, being cannibals, or, this is the impression. And that they didn't have any vast civilization at all. Now, recently we find out, oh, wait, here's some, big mounds, and maybe there was a temple or a great pyramid or some ruins. They once had cities, but when was that? Well, it was, 1500 or before. Their culture was from 500 to 1500. But after 1500, they were gone. Well, wait a minute. Who destroyed them in the 15th century or the whatever? Who destroyed them? What was the war going on around 1500? We don't know anything about that. And why didn't the Native Americans build up another civilization after that? Or did those people stay and keep murdering them? Or what was going on between 1500 and year today? Or 1776? What was going on for 200-300 years before 1776? Why are there maps with Chilago and Marata, and these huge cities up and down the Mississippi. New Orleans was not called New Orleans. St. Louis wasn't called St. Louis. I think it was called Tahakia or Tahokia. I can't remember now. But, of course, Joseph Smith said that there was a city near there called Manti, and one up there in the corner of Iowa and Illinois and Ohio, wherever that little corner up in there, they called that Zarhemla. But we have no record of any of this. Why would there be 500 years with nobody there? Or 200-300 anyway, until they started coming over, the British, started coming over. What happened? They massacred them so bad in 1500 that they just were refugees running around in tents? Or did they continue to live and have cities? Wooden buildings, cities, buildings that may have decomposed. Why are we believing that it's 1500, that this mound was 1500? How come we don't have any very much, why is it that we believe their narrative and their scientific data that tells us this is how old it was or whatever? I think something happened between 1500 and 1776 that we don't have a lot of information on. But just going by their understanding, there was a French culture from Ontario and Quebec down through the Great Lakes, down through the Ohio Valley, and down through the Mississippi, and all the way to New Orleans, and even all the way to Missouri. So this is vast territory that was, at the time of when the British came over, the French were superior in battle and in war and in defense.
Long before Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, French and English seafarers knew of a heavily forested, inhospitable land to the west of the Grand Banks. There seemed little to tempt them there, but by the beginning of the 17th century, both the French and the English had planted colonies. But wherever civilization spreads, war inevitably follows. At first, the struggle, bitter and savage though it might be, was no more than a series of raids and counter-raids. But in 1754, near the forks of the Ohio River, a minor ambush sparked off a full-scale war between Britain and France. A war which would eventually decide the fate of a continent.
They were agricultural, they were good people, they were getting along with the natives. They were one nation with the native peoples. That's why the native peoples hadn't built any more cities, because the cities that the native peoples built were in conjunction with French people who were from, they say in one of these clips I'll show you, that the people, some of them came over from Marseille, France. Remember even Jefferson and these guys and Madison, they were all talking about Monticello and Montpellier and all of these things. This is where they came. Where did the Statue of Liberty come? Why is it from France? Why is there a big statue, a golden statue of some lady with a liberty hat and a torch of freedom in Chilago? This is what we need to come to grips with. This is what we need to understand, because nobody seems to have any clues. And I'm trying to dig up these clues. And I think it's been all completely wiped off the face of the earth. Now, if they burned it down in the late 19th century, they burned all this down. Murdered everybody, took the children, re-indoctrinated them, as we've talked about yesterday. Well, we need to find some evidence as to what they were doing and what they were wiping out. What really happened from the days of early Chilago and Maratha and Manti, Zarahemla. We need to find out what was really going on in the United States. I think it's very important that we find out, because there's got to be a reason that they've wiped all this information out. Now, I don't believe it's like a lot of people are trying to say, and I'm just so, I'm exasperated by the fact that so many lies that have been started are creeping into individuals that want to know, and they just accept it. Don't accept things that you don't have absolute proof for. There are possibilities, you can look into them, but you've got to have some proof. All these people talking about mud floods, there was no worldwide mud flood. Of course there were. The science tells you, archaeologists tell you got to dig down to get to the city. The ground is growing. We don't know why. It isn't just in one area or another area. They had to dig the pyramids out of the sand. All these, even here in the desert, all these ruins are under the ground. And they tell you it's a definite fact. And I made a mistake, and I think it caused some problems for people yesterday in that video, because I misspoke. My mind gets to wound up, and I'm talking, and I don't even notice that I've said something that's not correct. I misspoke. I think people think what I was saying yesterday is that the ground's going to go up 100 feet in 100 years. What I said was that I had found someplace that the AI had told me that it goes a foot a year. But when I went back, it said 1 to 3 inches. And I actually think that's probably more correct, meaning about 2 inches, 1 to 3 or 2 inches. 2 inches a year. Now, you say, well, I've lived in the same area and we never had any, in the last 20 years, the ground hasn't moved. Well, in 20 years, it would have only moved in 20 years, 2 inches a year, that would only be about 40 inches, 36 inches and 3 feet. So a little over 3 feet. That's a long ways in 40 years. But remember that in some areas, there's a lot of forests and jungles where nobody goes in and sweeps the ground and keeps patting it down and rototilling sweeping their front yard, or taking the grass mowing, taking the grass cuttings and burning them, or starting fires, or getting rid of the accumulation. But over time, probably when a settlement dwindles and not so many people there in the village, and the buildings that were left abandoned, then the wind comes in and moves the dirt in over it. So you can keep that dirt and that growth at bay in a town for 50 years. You wouldn't even hardly notice, maybe a few inches here and there. It starts edging up the side of the hill, but you don't really notice it. Within a generation, the buildings fall down. You build another building on top of it. There might have been a basement that you built another building on top. There's reasons for all this. And there's another thing I want to talk about, probably in an upcoming video, is that mulch doesn't stay there. It also decomposes and becomes oil, and it seeps into the ground. So it's like what grows with plant life, biological life that builds up, it decomposes and turns into a black gooey substance that we're using for fuel here and burning in our cars up and down the highways and the jets and on the planes and all of this. And we're pumping oil out of the ground. And this is another one of these lies and hoaxes that they're playing on us. They keep talking about global warming and pollution, because when the cars are driving, they're got exhaust. Well, that's nothing much different than a volcano. It wouldn't destroy the world. It might change the climate a little bit. So that's not the worst part. The worst part is that if we suck all the oil out of the ground, and it would be hard to do because there's lots of oil down there, but we've been doing it for 100 years, sucking the oil out of the ground by the barrel or the tanker ship or whatever, and it's just an enormous amount of sucking. Now, when we started off today, I mentioned that volcano that's going off on the 4th of March that's probably changing the weather, because it perhaps might be making the weather better. The volcanic ash is a natural thing. Goes up into the atmosphere, the ionosphere, or whatever. Maybe it protects us. Maybe it keeps us warm, gives us rain. I don't know what it all does. So we've got a volcano going off right now, and I think we're about to have a series of volcanoes going off, because the weather's definitely changing, even more than it did in 1980. And just in a few weeks, and I don't know what's going to happen now, and if another one goes off. But the thing of it is, why are they going off? If they're fracking and sucking oil, then you would think there'd be less volcanoes, because they're removing the fuel that nature needs to create these volcanoes to keep the weather good. Because I think the volcanoes create a greenhouse effect and make the weather better. We go into a deep freeze when we pull all that oil out of there. So perhaps when something happens, we get a lot of snow, maybe we get a greenhouse effect. We start raining, and then that causes a lot of ice at the poles, and that shifts different things ecologically. Maybe the more greenhouse, more rain, freezing at the poles, more ice. This kind of makes an exponential thing to where it starts getting colder and colder. We have an ice age for a while. The ice age means that there's no more trees growing, producing air to breathe, and not dropping mulch to go down the ground and produce more fuel. And maybe after a while, there's no more fuel down there because of the ice age, and the volcanoes stop producing so much volcanic activity. And this creates a warm-up again. When the volcanoes take off again, then there may be a cool down. So if the volcanoes are going to start erupting, as the Bible says they will, in the Great Tribulation, it's a period of change. And if they're going to start erupting, then that means perhaps the world will start getting colder. Because that dust is in the atmosphere, not allowing the sun to shine through. Now, others say that creates a greenhouse. I don't know. I'm just bringing this up, that there's probably something very bad going on when we suck out all the oil from under the ground. The other thing I was telling you is that the earth could be growing 1 to 2 to 3 inches every year. And this could be why you have to dig down to find archaeological ruins and stuff. Well, if that's the case, I think that a lot of this mulch eventually seeps in and decomposes and goes down into the ground and makes the oil. So then it ends up being burned off as it comes up out of the volcano and goes into the atmosphere. And so maybe in a sense, some of the extra bulk, or the mulch and the trees and the leaves and all that becomes mulch, ends up becoming fuel and then burns off. So it doesn't accumulate as much as we might think. Perhaps there would be a foot or more if we didn't have all this mulch seeping into the ground making oil. However, there's still a percentage of the mulch that is minerals and rocks and different materials that don't necessarily decompose all the way or something. And they're also, the mulch is also producing more vegetation to grow even faster, bigger forests and bigger jungles. So the more jungles we have, the more soil, the more jungle we have, then that means eventually we have more oil, and then it blows off the volcanoes, and then we get colder, and then there's no more vegetation because it gets too cold. This could be a cycle that happens naturally. We may just be speeding up the cycle. Or perhaps our little efforts at sucking oil out is nothing compared to the fact the earth is so huge. Maybe it means nothing. I don't know. But I am saying that it's pretty obvious that the mulch causes the oil causes the volcanoes, and that would be the natural order of things. So I don't know the exact reason why we may be going through this weather change. Probably the government is doing a lot of it with their little weather weapons and so forth. But there is a serious problem with them sucking out all the oil under the ground. I don't think that's a good thing at all. And I don't know whether that's causing, we're getting to a point now we're going to end up having a lot more volcanoes go off because of that. It would seem counterintuitive, but less oil, you'd think there'd be less volcanoes. Unless the volcanoes are happening now because of the fracking. Maybe they can't really suck that much oil out of the ground because we're not using much as a human race. We're not using as much as we think we are. But maybe the big problem is the fracking and the oil's going through these cracks and going into certain areas where it shouldn't be, where it's hot or something. But of course, we have all kinds of problems, that we don't know about, like the position our solar system is in compared to its rotations, and maybe it comes around to the ecliptic of the galaxy or whatever and flips, and there could be all this magnetism from some planet or sun that we're approaching. We're getting close, and it's making a pull, just like the moon pulls on the tides. We might be going through a natural place in the heavens where this just naturally causes the earth to have volcanic activity. And you also have to keep in mind that if we're going to have more volcanoes, and then that means there's hot lava on fire, probably because of this fuel that's down there, like lakes of this oil that's burning, and that could cause earthquakes. So we could see a number of earthquakes begin to happen. And maybe this is all just coming to a critical point. Maybe the scientists actually know that, and they're preparing for it, and we need to prepare for it. But I don't know. I just know that that's a side point. The most important thing is what we've learned about our country, that George Washington was a Huguenot, basically a Cathar, and had traditions back to Mary Magdalene, and that this is a spiritual battle, and we're destined to win. And the truth is coming out, friends. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and go. I'm going to leave it there. Hope you have a wonderful evening. And it's already dark here, so I got to go and get this uploaded. Hope you guys have a wonderful evening. The Lord will bless you. His grace be with you. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one, guys.